Good Friday, 1923. An 11-year-old street urchin Italian kid plays on the sidewalks of his Hoboken tenement neighborhood. A few short miles away, his 36-year-old bricklayer father works on a lower Manhattan construction site. Good Friday means the men will be quitting early, 3 o'clock. But as 2:30 approaches, it will be only moments before the building collapses and the boy's father is crushed to death. The boy's childhood died that afternoon in March, crushed almost as literally as his father's warm flesh beneath the tons of rubble and cold brick. 17 years later, having replaced his father on the scaffold, the boy of 12 shouldered with the responsibility of feeding the surviving family, he will recreate this experience as a classic novel of the 20th century. The boy who would become author was Pietro di Donato. The title of his book, Christ in Concrete. Hi, my name is Dick Di Donato, and I'm thrilled you could join me, along with David Callett, Fred Gardefay, and Norma Barsman, to screen the film and discuss this cinematic masterpiece. The masterwork, I might add, of one of Hollywood's classic contract directors, Edward Dmytryk. The film was shot entirely in England, but this location footage with which the title sequence is laid over was shot by a small crew sent over from the UK. I particularly like the dynamic ice flows. I think it looks like the Hudson shot from the Jersey side. I really love this footage. It's got such a hard-boiled late 40s look. You almost expect to see Edmund O'Brien racing down the sidewalks, bowling over people in his leather-soled Florsheim's. So noirish and stark. It's really interesting now, the way Dmytryk cut this together. The sequence moves from an American noir look more and more towards a European realist mood, till concluding with what looks like any number of post-war bombed-out cities. And there it is right there. It's a very realist-looking mongrel there. It looks like it could take a real chunk out of your ankle. And then when we fade down, this is the last location exterior shot, and we fade up, and we're on the soundstage of Denham Studios, Denham, England, the art director's recreated world. I'd like to read real quickly from the 1978 autobiography of Edward Dmytryk. A dark, wet, dingy street lined with cold water flats stretches away into the night. Steam spouts from under manhole covers and is raggedly dispersed by a biting wind. Scraps of newspapers flap helter-skelter through the scene. A man's feet stumble into the foreground. After a few steps, the man comes to a spastic stop and stares up at the tenement above him. It looks as if the building's going to come crashing down on him. With a wide sweep of his arm, he drives away the fear and scrambles up the stairs into the nearest doorway. We were in New York, but New York was a film set in Denham, England. The studio had given us their largest stage, and we needed it. We had to build an entire block of cold water flats for a little money and make it look real. I'd started work while still in Hollywood with a young assistant art director named MacDonald. He understood our needs and his own. He needed a reputation. He went to work to devise a number of ingenious sets. This was the first. The elevated railway pillars in the foreground were fully equipped with train shadows and sound effects. Cardboard cutouts simulated one whole side of the street. The distant cross street was live and would accommodate full-size cars and wagons. Behind that, the street continued into the distance by courtesy of a forced perspective backdrop. I was proud of the steaming manholes. They were my idea. It's one of his biggest impressions of New York, the dirty streets and manhole vapors. Now, for the first time, to my knowledge, they were put on the screen. And that's from Edward Dmytryk's 1978 autobiography. So, David Callett, the motto of All Day Entertainment is, your logo model is
movies that fell through the cracks.
Fell through the cracks. And how does this qualify? How does this rate in that department, according to this?
It's hard to imagine a movie of any greater stature falling any farther into a crack than this one has.
As big a crack as this.
For all of the awards that it won, in Europe at least, on its original release, and the incredible esteem with which its own makers held it. In many interviews, Dmytryk referred to it as what he considered his greatest film. Then it pretty much vanished off the face of the earth. Outside of screenings on Italian TV, it's been almost impossible to see, certainly impossible to see in the United States. I think for a generation of filmgoers who may have run across it in film histories and have absolutely no idea what the thing is a reference to, it's long overdue to be put back on the commercial marketplace. My understanding of the reason why it disappeared the way it did, partly, and I know that Norma, among others, will get into the reasons why it had such difficulty on its U.S. distribution. But another aspect of this was that the remarkably unique contract that Pietro Di Donato's agent, Lucy Kroll, was able to write with the producers caused the rights to revert back to him. And ultimately their somewhat fly-by-night production company fell apart, and there was no real institutional entity keeping track of the film. Nobody was distributing it in the United States, nobody was maintaining it because the copyright had reverted to someone who did not own a print. And in the late 1960s, he got interested in shopping it around for TV sale, and began the inquiries into getting access to materials to put it out there for TV broadcasts, and discovered that Plantagenet Films no longer existed, and that nobody was aware of the existence. Right, nobody.
Rank was defunct. Right?
Precisely, and there was no print to be found. And by the early 1970s, he was getting rather despondent about this, and that was when discussions started to circulate about doing a remake with Robert De Niro. And just in order to have anything to show, my understanding is that the copy that had been filed with the Library of Congress as part of the copyright application, that was taken and duplicated. And that was the print that was then used in 1975 for a New York screening that coincided with the reissue of the novel. And outside of that screening, it hasn't been seen in the U.S. since 1950.
This is, for all practical purposes, a totally unseen film in the United States. I'm going to say 100% unseen in the United States. It's never shown on American television. And it showed in the New York City area in 2 or 3 theaters for maybe a week or 2. So if you can round up the living souls that saw it in New York. Norma Barsman.
It's time to say why America, why the
Yes.
American people did not see this film. It's long overdue. This film had to be made in England because the 3 people, Sam Wanamaker, the star, Eddie Dmytryk, the director, Ben Barsman, the screenwriter, were all blacklisted. And instead of being able to make it in New York City, where it should have been made, they had to go to Denham, England, to make it. And I think one of the most extraordinary things is that a picture that really is important in film history, the way Salt of the Earth is important in film history, was made by 3 blacklisted people. Salt of the Earth also was made by Herbert Biberman, director, Paul Jarrico, producer, and screenwriter Michael Wilson. But the blacklisted had to find a way to work. And I think that this is the point at which to say that Eddie Dmytryk, who was blacklisted in November 1947 after the HUAC hearings and after the Waldorf Accord, which agreed to blacklist, came to Ben Barsman, who was still working at MGM on a terrible Lana Turner picture. And Eddie Dmytryk came in. I happened to be at MGM in Ben's office, so I know what happened. I don't know how Eddie got in the studio, because actually it was the policy of the studios in Hollywood not to permit any blacklisted person to enter the gates of the studios. But he got in, and he came up to Ben's office with a book under his arm. And he put the book down on Ben's desk with a flourish, right on top of the Lana Turner script. And he said, "Ben, you've got to do this. "You've got to write the screenplay of this." And I looked at it and I said, "My God, Christ in Concrete." One of the 3 books which formed me in a way, which made me a progressive, which I came across when I was 18 at Radcliffe, and my professor said this is the only authentic American proletarian novel. And I loved it. And I always thought about it because there were 3 things. There was that showed me the depression and the plight of American labor, the working man. A picture about, a book about the Spanish Civil War, In Place of Splendor, and Johnny Got His Gun, a book by Dalton Trumbo about imperialist war. Anyway, those 3 books formed me, made me a part of the progressive Hollywood community, which I discuss in my new book, The Red and the Black List.
Which is a phenomenal book.
Which thank you, David.
Well, it is.
But anyway, but what's phenomenal about it is the way it's becoming timely. Right now, everything is coming together. Here I am looking at this picture and remembering how Eddie came into the office and said to Ben, "You're going to do this right now." And Ben said, "How could I possibly? I'm in the middle of this."
Norma, how about a little background on Dimitri at this time? This was, when he walked in the office, it was 1947?
No, it was not. It was November 48. He had been unemployed, couldn't work in Hollywood for 1 year.
Okay, give us a little background on what he'd done up to that point.
Yes.
And why he came to your husband.
That's right.
To write the script.
We've got an important little, okay.
Ben and Eddie worked together at RKO on a film called Back to Baton with John Wayne. And they had become very buddies because John Wayne was so reactionary and the 2 of them were progressive. So they sort of banded together and thought up horrible stunts for John Wayne to do that would, John Wayne would never call for a double, no matter how difficult the stunt. So Eddie and Ben thought up these terrors that were really blood-curdling. Anyway, that made them buddies, in spite of the fact that Eddie was a pretty difficult guy, because my first contact with Eddie had been before I met Ben. When I got to Hollywood, I went to the School for Writers and met Eddie's then wife, Madeline. And one of the first things I knew about Eddie was that what Madeline said, how he treated her and how he treated their child, Michael. This may not be the place for it, but so I had a fixed image of what Eddie was like. However, we became very good friends in the days when Eddie was married to Madeline. We saw each other many times, 3 nights a week. We did things together. Then when there was no more Madeline and there was Jeannie Porter, Eddie and Jeannie Porter became our close friends. We went to jazz things together. We were all jazz fiends. And so I knew Eddie socially and well. And of course, Eddie respected more than respected, admired so much Ben's talent. And I guess I should say that Adrian Scott, who was the producer, and Johnny Paxton, who was a screenwriter at RKO, I'm just thinking of the progressive people there, and Ben, who were buddies, looked down on Eddie because, as a person, they felt he was okay technically, very good technically, but both as a human being and as a political person, which he sort of flirted with, because Eddie joined the party but never read anything, never understood anything, never really should have been near the Communist Party or anything political because he didn't understand it.
He was a technician. He was,
Yes.
a master technician.
And-
But importantly, he had done Crossfire, which
Yes.
was, you know, I have actual letters here from, and for historical reference, I want to say that when Lucy Kroll started the negotiations to make this film, she was at the time, at the beginning, she was at the Sam Jaffe Agency. Then she went off on her own. By the time the movie was made in '48 and released in '49, she had her own agency, the Lucy Kroll Agency. I have a letter here dated December 23. Let's start with the first one, April 1, '46. Dear Pete, that's my father. I have received a cable today from Geiger, Rod Geiger, the producer of this film, saying that he and Rossellini will return to the United States by the end of May. Rossellini and Geiger will absolutely do Christ in Concrete, and they will adjust all matters upon their return in May. And that was April 1, 1946. Then, December 23, right at the end of the year, 1946 still, from Lucy Kroll again. Dear Pete, I have received a letter from Fabio Cohen, who is the Italian representative for the Society of Authors Representatives. In my letter to him, I had asked him to get me some information about Mr. Visconti and to contact Rod Geiger regarding Visconti's adaptation of Christ in Concrete. And then December 16th, the letter from Italy to Lucy Kroll. In accordance with your instructions, I have called up Mr. Geiger, but could not get in touch with him since he is at present out of Rome. Unfortunately, I am leaving for Milan, blah, 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 and then, next paragraph. I know Mr. Luchino Visconti for previous dealings with him, and I can thoroughly recommend him as a financially sound producer. Now, this is interesting. He's referred to as a producer at that time.
Not a director.
He'd been a theater producer. He'd done Crime and Punishment and The Glass Menagerie over there in Rome. So here we have the inklings of the beginning of neorealism.
Well, and also I want to point out to the viewers of the disc, if you want to go through these documents and chart this
that's right.
backstory,
Yes.
all of this is included in the DVD-ROM section on the DVD
of course.
for everyone to follow through, and to help clarify how this connection with Rossellini and Rod Geiger and Pietro Di Donato was when Rod Geiger was stationed in Italy. He ran across Rossellini, apparently. I think you can probably tell the story better than I.
Well, David, Geiger was a GI, and it was I don't know, the war was ending, but it was sort of Americans were coming into the boot of Italy, and Geiger was able to round up raw stock and stuff for Rossellini, and
Worked in the film corps.
yes, yeah. And that was really what made it possible for Rossellini to shoot. There was just no other way.
And the film he was making was Open City.
Yeah, Open City, and they shot Open City with this stock, and it made Geiger actually a hero.
And then
And he also kept them going. He used to, because they didn't have enough money to do anything. And I don't know how Geiger did it, but I know that he managed to get money here, food there, women there, and
let's make a point here that
raw stock there.
That first, what would be considered probably the springboard into Italian neorealism was a collaborative community project with writers like Serge Amade, who I was fortunate enough to hang out with and watch soccer games with in his apartment in 1975. Serge Amade, the great Italian screenwriter. A little unknown guy who was hand-to-mouth starving at the end of the war, Fellini, Serge Amade, Fellini. These guys, they all band together. They weren't prima donnas at that time. They were all starving young artists. And they all teamed together and their combined efforts produced the classic Open City, which was filmed, I understand, while this part of the city at least still had some Germans in control of part of the city. So it was really more documentary almost than sort of a fictionalized.
And somehow
Film.
it came to pass that Pietro Di Donato was hired to do the English subtitles
Right.
for the American
Right,
release
did the
of the film.
translation. But the reason I started getting into Rossellini and all that was because you see here from this documentation that it looked like Rossellini was going to do it, that it looks like Visconti was going to do it, and one can almost, simply wonder, can only wonder what this film would have been like if it had been done by Rossellini or by Visconti. But my father had just seen Crossfire with Robert Ryan, Dimitrich's Crossfire, the anti-Semitic film, and was so impressed with it that that was a real hard-boiled look, mid-40s look, that's for sure, Crossfire. And was so impressed with it, he said, I want this guy Dimitrich to direct it, and that's how it ended up being this. Now the novel Christ in Concrete was out of publication for through the mid-70s or late 70s to the early 90s. At that time, it was discovered by an editor at Penguin Putnam, and she realized that she was going to bring this classic novel out permanently, so it will be permanently available to students and to the world. And it was released in early 90s, around 1992, as a Signet Classic on the Signet Classic imprint of Penguin Putnam. And we were very fortunate to have a dear friend of my father's who befriended him towards the end of his life. He still had a good 10 good years of productivity. And this fine fellow, this professor, flew him out to Chicago, and they became fast friends. And the world authority, if you will, on Christ in Concrete, did the introduction. Studs Terkel did the preface. Fred Gardefee did the introduction to the Penguin Putnam Signet Classic, which is in permanent distribution. And they became fast friends. Fred did the introduction, and believe it or not, today being March 15th, I met Fred Gardefee for the first time yesterday. And let's hear some historical and academic perspective of the book.
Well, I'd also like to bring in this point that Pietro told me this story, and I don't know if there's anybody out there who can verify it, but it certainly marks, certainly is a good story to come from him, that when they were considering things to do, who was going to produce and direct Christ in Concrete, he said, Fred, I had Capra come to me one day and say that he wanted to do Christ in Concrete. And I said, you capitalist pig, there's no way I'm going to let you touch this beauty. And one could wonder what would have happened had Capra done that.
How's this for timing? Uncle Luigi's about to slap the pig on the butt.
Well, there you go.
Yes.
To me, that scene, I mean, I bring that scene into a talk I give called Linguini and Lust.
And this is interesting, Fred, and everyone, that all of a sudden we take on a almost 30s Hollywood musical feel with this production piece inserted into the middle of the film.
And this was a song that was written for the movie. The music was written by the composer Benjamin Frankel, and the words were written by Ben Barsman. I have been in email contact.
Ben wrote the words to this song.
I've been in email contact with the stepson of Benjamin Frankel. His name is Dimitri Kenaway, and he has been sharing a couple of insights on Frankel's career as a film composer. He was also a very highly regarded orchestral composer, and is perhaps better known for his for his actual concert pieces more so than his film work. And in 1951, he did what was called the Violin Concerto, and also called For the 6 Million, which was an enormous requiem for those who had perished in the Holocaust.
Wow.
And the interesting thing is that musically, you can hear many of the themes of that concert being worked out beforehand in the score on Christ in Concrete, which not only shows the seriousness with which he treated this particular subject matter, but it also sort of brings in a lot of that tragic and historically epic character into the music of this film. One of the other extras that we have on this DVD, in addition to an isolated score to focus on Frankel's music, is an unusual piece, a 1965 recording of a performance of the story of the book set to an experimental music score by Harold Seletsky, using 12-tone music, which is also called serial score. And Frankel is known, narrated by Eli Wallach. Frankel is known as having done the first ever manifestation of 12-tone music in British cinema music in his score to the Hammer horror film Curse of the Werewolf.
Wow. So the Frankel piece, which, by the way, I feel is an absolute standalone masterpiece, the soundtrack to this movie, and I'm so pleased that you have it isolated from the British Film Institute, and it's isolated form, so people can just hit the musical soundtrack and listen to it, on its own. Should not be confused with the Harold Seletsky piece, which was approximately 1960, narrated by Eli Wallach. Yeah, that came out as a LP, and it was also performed at Carnegie Hall a couple of times. And I remember it was pretty exciting just to go see Eli backstage when he was on Broadway and so forth. And that is a very interesting piece, and also a wonderful piece of music by Harold Seletsky. But I have a couple of questions that I pulled from. I've been reading the intro to the Signet Classic publication of Christ in Concrete, and Fred's introduction, and there are some points that I've always needed some clarification on. You say, Fred, that in 1966, Warren French wrote a book entitled The Social Novel at the End of an Era. And in the study, he portrays Di Donato as an example of, quote, the very irresponsibility that destroyed the age. What the hell did he mean by that?
Well, what he meant by that was that the politics of the period took over the aesthetics of literature.
And what the hell do you mean?
Well, what he meant.
What do you mean?
What do I mean?
Yeah, I don't understand that.
What do I mean by using the quote?
No, I'm sorry. Your explanation of it.
Okay.
What you just said.
My explanation is that this is a person who's totally insane. It's the same thing that Robert Boone said about African American literature. You can't bring politics. You can't mix politics and literature. You begin to accept a lesser aesthetic than if you would, for example. And here, I think he was thinking of somebody like, he would take a look at the writing of Mike Gold, for example, and put that in the same category, as opposed to Hemingway or a Faulkner or other people who are writing during this period. And he would separate politics and art. It was this attempt to keep it separate. It's also during the period in which they're beginning to develop new criticism. So they're trying to create a kind of a mathematics, scientific, structural formula for elevating their profession, and politics doesn't mix with this. We wear gloves when we read our books, white gloves. We're not going to get our hands dirty. So to me,
in other words, French was basically stating that it was too gutsy, too real, and what does he mean by the very irresponsible that destroyed the age? What exact age?
Well, he's talking about the age of literature of the 1930s and 1940s.
Proletarian?
Exactly, yeah. But well, the early proletarian literature, as opposed to, what the idea is here that, Pietro is a worker. He's not a writer.
Right.
You know, and
So
Pietro
it's-
wasn't even really a good member of the Communist Party.
Right, exactly. So in other words, here this guy comes in a bull in a china shop. So to speak.
Exactly.
All right,
Exactly.
okay, I understand.
And here we are, and we're taking this thing and we're making it into this big. We're trying to make art out of something that is just raw. Is the way he looked at it, and there's no seasoning here. There's no sense. I mean, when you read Christ in Concrete, you say, what books did this guy read in order to be able to produce this?
See, I have to get it translated out of academia to understand it.
Right, exactly. Well, I'm glad to do that.
The prototypical ethnic American novel, peculiar aspects of Italian immigrants, which leads us into Di Donato's Italianita novel's diction, broken pidgin English and literal translations. And I want you and Norma, because I found one of the very interesting whole middle section of Norma Barsman's The Red and the Blacklist. And Norma, I hope you don't mind, but I could not resist typing out a blurb on your book and what's also amazing, and I know I'm jumping around here, but your fabulous memoir, which is a full lifetime memoir of decades and decades, is premiering, coming out in the spring of 2003, and David's release of Give Us This Day is premiering to the world literally almost to the same day or week. After 55 years of the making of this film, that these two works on separate tracks should coincide and come out within days of each other is absolutely, and I didn't know it either. You contacted me out of the blue, and we put this together just a couple of weeks ago. But after reading an advanced copy of The Red and the Blacklist by Norma Barsman, I sat down and typed out a quick blurb. Aside from being wildly entertaining, The Red and the Blacklist is an indispensable tool for the student of political science, fiction, journalism, and especially film. Norma Barsman's memoir is an almost encyclopedic who's who of 20th century cultural literacy. In short, a must for the independent thinker and all aspiring artists.
Hey, hey.
Well, save that for the paperback.
I like that.
This is I'm going to interject here
Great.
because we've come upon a scene that has multiple levels of significance. The movie had originally been prepared under the title Christ in Concrete. One of the handful of objections that the British censors put forward was that the word Christ could not be used in a movie title.
Yes, Trevelyan told us right then and there.
And so it had to be retitled as Give Us This Day. When the picketers in the U.S. began to protest the film and endanger its distribution, in order to sneak it into theaters, it was given an alternate title so that people wouldn't know what they were seeing, which is just, that's the strangest distribution strategy I can possibly imagine. Let's put a movie out and not tell people what it is. But the alternate U.S. title was Salt to the Devil, and this is the scene that produces that wording.
Clarify that, David. The alternate
Alternate American title for the movie was Salt.
Released
in Europe as Give Us This Day.
Give Us This Day.
And it was also released here as Give Us This Day, but also additionally as Salt to the Devil. With the publicity that Salt of the Earth has been getting, I was joking with Norma earlier that I thought it might be fun to sell the DVD under the title Salt to the Devil and try to confuse people.
Well,
but the other significance of this particular scene was that when the cast and crew were assembled at Denham, it was discovered only then that Lea Padovani did not actually speak English, which was a source of considerable concern to the filmmakers that their star could not speak the language that the movie was going to be in. And Dimitrik told a story that he had actually considered just sending her back and starting over with a new actress, and out as a courtesy to her, agreed to do a screen test. And this was the scene that they screen tested, and halfway through it he realized that she had such a sense of vulnerability and femininity that there was no other Annunziata but her.
Then fought for her to stay. She came to our hotel in Kensington, and she had learned this is before shooting anything. We didn't realize that she couldn't speak a word, but she had learned one sentence. This: I have fallen in love with your screenplay the way a woman falls in love with a man. And she could say that perfectly. And she could say nothing else. But Ben said, on the basis of that, I'll be for you, don't worry.
And
he
Dmitrik
was,
loved her so much that
Dmitrik, he was almost at the point of sending her back when she couldn't
and he loved her
understand
performance so
anything
much he hired her again on a later film called The Reluctant Saint. So they did work together again.
When we, they're starting their 3-day honeymoon here. And maybe, Norma, maybe you can clear this up for me.
Yes.
I always state, you know, once that footage shot on location in New York by the small crew which was sent over.
With Phil Brown.
Right, with Phil Brown, the assistant director. Once that ends and
Some of that stuff that you love very much was Phil Brown shooting, you know, the stuff in New York.
Oh, yes.
Yes, I just
love
wanted
that
you to,
footage.
you know, it
And-
wasn't Eddie, it was
Right.
Phil Brown.
Okay, fine. And now we come up and we're now. I think. Do you know if this was shot outside and not on the soundstage of Denham Studios? I feel this is outside. It's just. I've watched it many times.
I
and,
thought it was,
I think this might be the only actual footage in the film that was in the film itself, not the credits. That's actually outside. But
Well, one of the things that cinematographer C. Pennington Richards received so much acclaim for
I
on
know,
this
but
film.
and we'll get to that.
Okay.
I know, but I've watched this carefully, and I just get the impression, especially looking off into the distance, that this is some neighborhood outside of London that they've recreated Brooklyn with. And I know what you're getting to, David, the lighting. Which,
Well, I'll come to that later, yes.
okay, and Dmitrik says the one other set requiring great ingenuity was the 4-story building, which eventually collapses, killing Jeremiah. And he goes into how they lit that, and we'll get into that. I don't mean to tease our viewers, but you know, you can't help but feel, Norma, I'm sure you'll agree when you watch this, that Leia Padovani is the heart and soul of this film.
yes, I
Like
think,
an Italian.
I would agree
kitchen.
with you. And by the way, Sam and Leia later played the Rose Tattoo on the stage together. But she learned English. She was a very apt pupil.
And by the time you're halfway through this film, all you can think about is half a jug of wine and plates of pasta. It's relentless.
When I teach this film, I also teach it in the context of other Italian-American films, like The Godfather. And that one scene we saw earlier with the crooner singing to the bride, you'll see that picked up very much in other films by Italian-Americans, is singing to the bride. And my sense always was that had this been a much more powerful film, we would probably not have seen, or we would have seen an alternate kind of Godfather. This would have been perhaps if Copper would have made it, you know, it would have been at that point, but it would not have had this kind of power, or this historical power, I think.
You never finished about Salt to the Devil, what it was, so I'll pick it
Oh,
up.
yes,
You didn't
please do.
say. And I can't remember the book, but you will be able to, Richard. I don't think there was any salt
No,
in the
definitely
book.
not. Definitely
But
not.
I want to tell you where Salt to the Devil comes from.
Hold that thought. I want to introduce one of the top character actors, who is the
Yes.
Swedish fellow, played
The
by
owner of the house.
Right, played by Carl Stepanek, and he plays Jaroslav.
Yaroslav.
Yaroslav, thank you. And my father inevitably would always comment, "Oh, isn't he just so human and so authentic and such a real character? Isn't he wonderful?" Dad particularly liked the character of the Swede who owns the house, and that brings me to the point that this film has such a rock solid supporting cast of character actors, important people across the board. I mean, it's just such a high level of supporting actors and actresses. Kathleen Ryan, my God, as Catherine Ryan as Kathleen, absolutely fantastic.
But yes, Norma,
Let
you
me
were going to
put back
explain about the Salt to the Devil.
But yes, because it belonged in that scene. That's an old Jewish custom.
And look at that shot.
And throwing the salt around
Right, there's the elevator train. Sorry.
in the, yeah. Ben was very superstitious. Not only the stage superstition and stuff, like not the hat on the bed, but he took over a great many of his mother's superstitions, and that was one of them. And that's where that came from, salt to the devil. In a new house, you threw salt around so that the devil would not bother you.
And Richard pointed out on the shot before with the elevated train going in the background, if you get a chance to skip back and review that particular shot of Sam Wanamaker and Leah Padovani coming in the back of the truck and compare it to the shot of the two of them getting into the back of the truck at the end of their wedding, you'll notice that in the background of both of those scenes, there is a sign on the building immediately behind them that makes sort of an in-joke comment on the scenes. At the end of the wedding, as they're boarding the van to ride out to their new home, the sign in the background says, "Importers, olives, and cheeses." And this is an interesting remark on the fact that he's imported a wife from Italy the way you might import some imported food. But it could just be coincidental, but it does strike me that when they are in the exact same position on the van, leaving that house and going to the tenement, we see a sign in the background that says "Universal Home Wreckers." And her home has now been wrecked. So I don't think it is purely coincidence. I think there's something going on
That's a very good comment, David, because nobody's discussed the way the position of women is dealt with in this picture and Salt of the, I keep going back to Salt of the Earth too, but some of these films, it's very, very important to look at the way women were dealt with women at the time.
Now here she's being taken to the dreadful tenement.
Yes.
This is, this is the atmosphere of Paul, the child of Jeremiah in the novel Christ in Concrete. This is the atmosphere that, the environment that my father grew up in. And this was what their home, once it was fixed up a little bit, this apartment looked like when Jeremiah was killed during the building collapse.
Which brings up one of the questions I've always been meaning to ask you and I've never gotten around to is, what has it been like for you to have this aspect of your personal history and something as raw as the suffering and death of your grandfather that's been dramatized for entertainment?
I can only answer that by remembering and relating to you how I felt when I watched my father. I didn't know Jeremiah. Yes, it was sad he was killed in a building collapse, but I never met the man. So I really can't feel an emotional direct attachment to him. But when I watched my father watch this film, and inevitably, when the lights came up, Ben Barsman's script, and the acting of Leah Padovani, he had tears in his eyes. He wiped the tears away from his eyes. We need only $275 more. So I could only experience it via his, pain and memory. I grew up in a very sort of middle class and upper middle class existence out on Long Island in the 50s and early 60s. Really quite removed, even though the site where he was killed was about 65 miles away. It was really another world. That's the best way I can answer that.
Even so, 1 in 3, that's 22.
But see, I think that it speaks for everybody's grandfather, because the first time I came across the novel, my grandfather was a hod carrier, and he would tell stories of friends of his who got killed. And Jimmy Breslin just did a book in which he admits that his awareness of this Mexican worker that he writes about would never have happened had not he read Christ in Concrete. And so, I was going to go back to the salt of the devil. Italians use salt too to cast the devil away. And it's interesting that you could have packaged a novel at the time, Christ in Concrete, but you could not take it to the screen but you could take the devil to the screen. And it was,
Things haven't changed much, by the way.
no.
And David, I often refer to Sam Wanamaker as my grandfather, so there you go.
It's remarkable when you gave me that picture of the real
Jeremiah,
how
which
much
our-
they look alike.
Which our viewers
can see in the photo gallery, yes.
You know, Fred and Norma can really bat this one around. Di Donato's Italianita, the novel's diction, broken pidgin English and literal translation of Italian into English, and Norma and Fred goes into I know this is a big part of the courses you teach, so I want to hear from both of you on this. But first, let's hear Norma. Tell us about how Ben was struggling and doing a lousy job on figuring out how to write the dialogue.
In the middle of the night, I came downstairs and found Ben talking pidgin Italian. I don't want you to do. It was really horrible. He was walking around. I'm not that kind of guy. I couldn't.
Spaghetti
And
English.
I said, "What are you doing?" And he said, "I'm practicing talking the way Pietro's characters talk." I said, no. They're talking Italian. They're talking very poetic Italian. And it hit him like an electric light in a funny paper. He said, you're right. He took me like this. He said, "You're absolutely right." And I was so happy. He began to dance the Gazotsky. I described this scene in my book, The Red and the Black List, because I couldn't believe it. He didn't go around dancing the Gazotsky band, but this was a peak moment in his life when he discovered they were talking poetic Italian. And it was the key. Then he could go right back to work. He went back to the typewriter and he began to work at it again, and that solved it for him.
He was not the only one to make that mistake. When the Italian translators were doing the Italian edition of the novel, they took those passages, which were supposed to have been in Italian but were rendered in English, and translated that pidgin English into Italian, producing dialogue in Italian that was choppy and incomprehensible.
Fred, how this is a big topic, big topic.
Yes, the language of Christ and Concrete is
And before you get into this, and hold that, this is classic Hollywood filmmaking. This is classic Dmitrik. Dmitrik started at RKO in the late 20s as a film cutter, as an editor, and you're going to see montage sequences here. This is filmmaking at its best.
And he said that his experiences as an editor was what turned him into the director that he was, because he would look with contempt on director after director who would shoot setup after setup after setup, take after take after take, and then he, as the editor, would throw all that film into the trash can.
Right.
And he was thinking to himself, even at that point, when I get behind the camera, I'm going to shoot what I need, which is the same kind of filmmaking which is often attributed to Alfred Hitchcock, what David O. Selznick called that goddamn jigsaw puzzle
Watch this
cutting.
montage. Now we have a lot of real working men here. You're going to see the hands of real bricklayers. One of the problems I have with this film is that when you see Jeremiah laying bricks, his hands don't look right. Believe me, I watched my father lay enough brick to know what a real bricklayer looks like. Now that's a real bricklayer. That's a real bricklayer. Those are the hands of a real bricklayer. See that? Every move, totally elegant, not a wasted motion. That is beautiful. And what a beautiful cut montage this is. This is Dmitrik. And by the way, historically, importantly, this film is possibly the only film, and Jeremiah wins, is possibly the only film that depicts the working man, the bricklayer, the construction worker in his element, doing his job as such. There just isn't a Hollywood film or Europe or anywhere that makes the working man and his hands and what he's doing the star of the film, like this film. This is an important historical depiction.
I'm going to quick interject something here because he's not on screen much, and I want to mention him while we do see him. Now he's in the very back. He's
Right.
moved over.
He's
He's
good.
the very, very back
Right.
there. We will later see him as the one that Sam Wanamaker sees through the glass begging.
Right.
I am
Yeah.
convinced that
Yes.
actor is George Pastel. He's not credited in
Sorry,
the film,
excuse me.
and his work in
Yeah.
in films in the early
Sorry.
1950s for many years was uncredited, so I'm not surprised that he was not getting screen credit yet. By the mid to late 1950s, he was getting credit and eventually had quite an interesting career in horror and science fiction films. Hammer fans will recognize him from The Mummy, Curse of the Mummy's Tomb, Stranglers of Bombay, and he had a very memorable role as the lead villain in the 1967 Doctor Who serial Tomb of the Cybermen.
Who could do this like David
So-
Cameron? I mean, really.
Yes, I-
George Pastel, ladies and gentlemen.
Now, let's,
I'm speechless here with David.
let's look at Kathleen Ryan a second.
Yes.
She is a very important, pivotal, fabulous casting, fabulous part, and beautifully written by Ben. Her dialogue and her scenes along with Jeremiah, especially in her apartment, are so crucial. The core of what's eating at his gut. Why hasn't he achieved the happiness and the American dream like he thought it was? Ben captured that so beautifully, and she is so good. And she made it to the cover of the DVD.
Worth it?
Brilliantly executed on the cover. Wait till you see
By
the cover.
David Landis.
Yes, and also I want to say that these interior shots, well, when I say interior, I mean inside of buildings, as opposed to supposed to being out on the street or at the construction site, which is all interior in the soundstage. In the club, the social club, the restaurant social club, if you will, saloon, are so authentic, so beautifully done. You just feel like you're in Lower Manhattan or New Jersey in 1923. It's just so real looking, and of course we need to get into C. Pennington Richards, top British cinematographer at the time. I'm going to make the statement that he was possibly the top cinematographer in the world at that time. This guy was brilliant, a real artist.
And there was an incident early on in the shooting when he was preparing the set, and the gaffer asked him, "Well, when are you going to light the actors?" And he says, "I'm done."
Right.
And at that point, all he had done was place 2 lights in the lamp fixtures in the room,
Right.
and that was it.
Right.
This was before the advent of fast enough film stocks
There's
that
that
one could
Italian thing,
actually
Fred.
use real natural lighting that would be another 15 years or so
And notice
before
how,
Barry Lyndon would do
notice
that.
here, David, he's not afraid to shoot up into these bare hanging
Precisely.
light bulbs.
There are deep shadows.
And-
these are very natural looking sets. They
Right,
are
right.
lit with lights,
Right,
but it
and
has
he's not
the
afraid
illusion
to,
of natural
right,
lighting.
and he's not afraid to shoot up into these raw bulbs hanging from the ceiling.
Norma has a
Yes.
story about this scene.
Well, yes, the British censor, Mr. Trevelyan, who called us in, said that this scene had to be played without your seeing Leia Padavani. Oh, look! I didn't realize that it was. How bad was it? Always cut like that? Wasn't there?
We saw her briefly in the
Yes,
tub.
but yes, you saw her so briefly. That's right. I guess I just remembered more of her. But Trevelyan said you could not have even a husband in the same room with a nude wife in the bathtub. So it had to be done this way.
And here we see the beginning of. Also, this is
Yeah.
really
This is
important.
very
Another story.
important. This is where they're putting away the money to save the house. And
There's the goal up at the top.
yes, they're getting there, the $500 they need to buy the house.
This was not in the novel.
No, it was not in the novel because this is completely Ben. It was Ben using the wall thing from when he was a little boy.
Measure the heights.
His mother, the Chinese vegetable man used to come by and he would put down how much money she owed on the wall. And little Ben realized that his mother and father didn't have the money to pay the vegetable man, and he got up on a chair and crossed out and changed the numbers so that by the time the Vegetable Man came 1 week later, or whenever he came, it was much reduced. Anyway, Ben remembered that, and he used the wall and the numbers.
Well, it finally paid off now.
And I think it's the best, it's the most wonderful way to show the passage of time.
And you
the
visualize
dealing with
this
time, you
abstract whole.
visualize how they are eating their house. And I think it's one of the most extraordinary things in the film.
Well, yes, when the amount starts being erased and going down, crossed off and going down, as opposed to up. So they start eating the house later on. Speaking of passage of time, I want to make sure we point out another very important, fabulous, strictly classic Hollywood montage sequence of the passage of time. The pages being ripped off the calendar, the birth of the children. As the years go by, and we go through, we fast forward through 7, 8, 9 years in a 50-second montage.
Yeah.
Classic Dimitric, top world-class cutting, editing, and constructing this montage, and you just don't see filmmaking like that anymore. Forget about it. You kidding? It's just, this doesn't exist. These were the pros. These were the pros that were trained in the late 20s, through the 30s, and into the 40s. And that's why it looks like it does.
Well, this was one of the stories that Norma was aptly pointing out in her book, the irony that so many of the great European filmmaking talent that got driven out of Europe at the start of World War II to escape the Nazis, and then the way the McCarthy hearings drove so many of the great American filmmaking talent back to Europe, that there were all of these tremendously talented writers and filmmakers and actors who were no longer able to make films over here, and whose work has largely gone unseen because it was made abroad.
Yes, I had a chance to see many of the films of the blacklisted in Vienna in 2000, where I was invited. They had 1 month retrospective of the films of the blacklisted. And what was extraordinary was that whether they were B pictures or not, they were so both human and humanist, nothing communist about them. They were feminist before their time. They were anti-racist. Anyway, the collection is just extraordinary that they had. They had about 50, 60 films there, made by blacklisted people during the 30s and 40s. Wonderful.
That must have been rewarding
and upsetting.
And emotional.
And at the same time, I went to the Jewish Museum in Vienna, and I saw a quote of Marcuse, who said, of course, about the Holocaust, we must remember so it doesn't happen again, but he evidently said something else, which was, and we must inscribe on our memory tablets that what our culture lost because of the Holocaust. And I realized that this could be applied to the blacklist and McCarthyism about what our culture lost.
Look how much talent became expatriated out of Hollywood.
Out of Hollywood, or just oblivion. Some of these films,
and even some
like
suicides.
this.
Even some suicides. Men that didn't even go to Europe to work, their
Right.
lives were destroyed, and their careers were destroyed. Now, let me point out, this is the birth of the first baby.
Yes.
And he's so concerned, and he's so, this is high tension for him, and so forth and so on. He's gonna also spend money for a doctor, which they're saved, out of the money for the house. But
Yes.
And then
right.
as the children progress, more kids, he becomes a little bit more blasé with each child as the time passes and so forth. Fred, the one of the overarching themes of studying the historical perspective of Christ and Conquer, the novel, is Job, J-O-B. What's the story on that?
What's the story? Well, it's the first question my students always ask. Why is job here without the job or a job?
And why is it capitalized?
It's capitalized, I think, because this is the great God that lured the Italians to the United States. But job is more than just a God luring. It's a way a working man prays. Job is the working man's church. Not the church, not the pie in the sky place where you go to on Sunday, where you pretend that you're living a dream, but where you deal day to day with the nightmare. I always refer to Christ in Concrete and this film as the American nightmare.
And how did, but it's also the flip side of that coin is the American dream.
Of course, you can't have a dream without a nightmare.
Right.
You wouldn't know the difference.
But you have the inherent horror story, that the great inscription on the Statue of Liberty: "Send us your tired, your poor, your huddled masses." They could come here, and they might still remain tired, poor, huddled masses. There's no guarantee that you can do everything right as he does in this film, and still,
And
the
these
world
guys
will
saying
grind
it's
you
not
down.
going to happen to me. I'm
Right.
not going to be the one that dies in the building.
Exactly,
fire.
but what happens is that we have a generation here that literally sacrificed their lives to make the next generation better. It's a very Christ-like experience, which is why we get the name Christ in Concrete in a sense. But so it is through work that man becomes God in the United States, not through church. And this is what Pietro is all about, because you can look at what a lot of other critics and writers will say and about Italian American literature, like Robert Viscusi. He will say the only thing that Italians could have become were gods in literature. And while that's a cute thing to say, I think what Di Donato does is he shows that the godlike qualities attributed to the patience of Job, for example. I mean, there's this play with the Job character in the Bible and so on. That these are the trials and tribulations that men must go through.
Here's this important, and hold that and continue that thought. Here's the beginning of the important sequence of the passage of a number of years. Here's the second baby.
All right, they keep coming out, yeah.
And they're all still sitting at the same table.
Right, and this is a great opportunity to talk about this core, the bundle of sticks, like 5 sticks in a bundle. These workmen, Bonar Coliano, thank you so much. Bonar Coliano, and William Sylvester as Giovanni. Sylvester went on to have an important part in 2001, the entire opening scenes of 2001, and Coliano really didn't go on as far as Sylvester did, and but got higher billing in this. And here we go, they're playing cards, and he's a lot more blasé about it this time, and then here we are with a pretty much a full-grown family. This is the real family in the tenement feel. You're not going to find this really depicted in that I can think of, really, any other feature film.
Well, the other thing you see in this film that you don't see in most American films of the time are people actually eating food.
And lots of it.
You know, I mean, this is what I talk about in my Linguini and Lust chapter of my new book. It's that, you know, you don't see Americans eating food. They'll sit down at the table, but when it comes time to put the food in their mouth, they'll cut to another scene. Whereas we do see a lot of that here, where they play with the spaghetti when they're flirting.
In your intro, you quote Jeremio in his belief in achieving the American dream, stating, once they save enough to buy their house, then no boss in the world can rob me of the joy of my home. Of course, ironically, but the money saved to buy the house was used to bury him.
Right. Norma, you were going to...
Well, I was going to say that one thing that very few people really point out, which is this, that while the film is faithful to the book, to its spirit, it's really very unlike the book.
Oh.
Yeah.
I mean, it is really not like the book,
a prequel.
because the book is
the beginning of the book is the end of the
There's no
movie.
structure.
Yeah, you can't-
It's not there.
You can't do it.
Now,
The beginning
what
of
I want to just
David
wait a minute,
said
but
the beginning of the book's the end of the movie.
I think this is very important because I think one of Ben's great things that he did with not only this film but several other adaptations he did of books was something extraordinary. When we came out of the Palais des Festivals after seeing Christ Re-Crucified of Kazantzakis, Kazantzakis came over to Ben and hugged him and kissed him and said, "This was an extension of my thought. It's not like the novel. When authors go and see a movie, it usually kills them. It wasn't like my book, but it is an extension of my thought, and that's what's important, and I'm really grateful to you. When we told this story to your father, Pietro said, this is what I feel about Christ in Concrete. It's not like my book, it isn't my book, but it's really the spirit of it, the way I felt. It's just what you say, an extension of my book, and that's what's important. It's right up there on the screen, and that's why he wrote in the book, you know, that he dedicated us. Thank you for that, because you both really cared about what I meant and what I felt.
Not spinning off in your own,
exactly.
your own direction.
Yeah.
This is one of the most poignant scenes of the entire film, where each man is the depression has started, they're out of work, all their families are starving, and each man sort of testifies, so to speak, for how bad things are for them. This is the five sticks in a bundle. Here they are, right here. And Uncle Luigi, by the way, Charles Goldner is in the center there. Is a fabulous character actor. Went on to do a star with Alec Guinness in Captain's Holiday a couple years later. And Frankel's music behind this is just lifts you. It just lifts you. It's sort of like the clouds parting.
I was going to say that it reminds me how the situation that they're in with such desperation, it opens them up to jobs that are not at all like what they used to have, that are not at all what they want to have. It makes them vulnerable to exploitation in the same way that the blacklisted filmmakers who were sent abroad found themselves unable to control the circumstances of their employment because it was really, you know, beggars can't be choosers. And I know that you have stories about how Ben was taken advantage of on this film.
I want to...
Ben was never paid for this film, I just want to say that. Not one penny.
And I keep telling Norma, I wasn't born then, or I was just being born.
Reparations. She wants reparations.
Not one penny.
But Fred, this goes right here. These men started at each other's throats, you know, concerned about their own welfare. Here he is walking the streets. Keep in mind, folks, this is all on the British soundstage. Look at this. Here's the shot. Look at that. Isn't that beautiful? Oh boy. And these are men with tremendous pride. And all these shots. Look at that lighting. David, let's talk a little bit about. Well, let's wait till we get onto the set of the construction site itself to talk about the way Pennington Richards lit this. But this is all on the British soundstage. This is not outside.
But the beauty, I think, of this and all this is that what your father achieved, or Pietro achieved in writing, we get a visual transference. I mean, the montage of work, the sound of work.
Right.
You don't get it any better in writing than you do when you read it.
Right.
And you don't get it any better in image than you do when you see it here.
Right.
It captured that.
Beautifully. Let me continue on this point. The men were first thinking about themselves, each one turning against the other, wanting that one job that Murden had offered. And here they are shoveling snow while the millionaire gets out of the limousine. But finally, they all sort of remembered their core values and pitched together and gave the job to either Luigi or Giovanni, one or the other, who needed it the most. And that is the core message of Christ in Concrete, the novel. Talk to us a little bit about this concept of the working man looking out for each other first to combat the exploitation.
This was the key, and this is where we find the biggest problems when Italians become Americans. Because Italians come with the sense, not so much a great sense of helping all of humanity, but certainly helping their family, their extension, their neighbors, and so on. And if you look at the earliest depictions of Italians in American film, Italians don't have this sense of camaraderie. And some people will go on to say, well, it's communism. No, there's community before there's communism. And this is what Italians bring to this country, the sense of community, the sense of people working together, of taking a little bit less and giving it so that all can survive. But it's not just helping somebody else, it's being helped by someone else. There's this gift economy where if I give something to you, I know that someday you're going to give something to me, and this is what keeps us going. You know, when students see this, they begin talking about, well, this kind of a Marxist interpretation. I said, well, you know, there was community before Karl Marx, and there will be long after. So you can't take this as kind of some kind of political angle.
Right. Right. It's reality. It's family. It's life. It's putting food on the table.
And the idea of you know, in America, people become individuals. I mean, everything Italian becomes destroyed through American individuality. This false sense of that you can be an individual, because it's like anybody knows the star on a team wouldn't be there throughout if it wasn't for the rest of the team. But we forget that in America because we want to simplify. It's easier in the United States to sell a simple lie than it is a complex truth, and that I think is the key. And I think what this film projects is a complex truth. I think that's why one of the reasons why it had a hard time being digested in the American imagination that wants simplicity, where things like Disney give the people an easy thing to hang on to.
Excellent. How true, how true.
But we can talk later.
You know, and here's
We have no secrets.
here's
Good and bad is known to them. It is the house.
Yaroslav?
Yes, Yaroslav.
Yaroslav, the owner of the house. And he's so human, and he needs the money, but he's so human, he's so torn. And Ben wrote this so beautifully, and it touched Dad. So it's funny how this character, this man here,
Yes.
got to Dad. You know, it was like the crux of that house thing. You know, the house thing, the home.
And this is another of those scenes where Richards has actually placed the lights on the set right in the camera's way. That the light you see on screen is the light that's lighting them.
This our house.
Ben had many of these problems as a little boy.
We have a lot.
His parents went through this sort of thing in Canada.
I will give you 100.
He was the man to write the film play.
It doesn't matter.
He's the right
It is
man.
my house.
But getting back to community, I think that what you find in the novel is my students are always looking for where's the main character. The main character seems to keep shifting. It starts out with Jeremio and the workers, and then it's Paul, and then it's Annunziata, and then it's the medium, the spiritual medium, and then it's the neighbors, and then it's the uncle. And I think that's the key that's why you get such beautiful. There's beautiful parts in here for a lot of actors, not just the stars.
Well, you had stated, Fred, that the book is more of a series of vignettes and scenes than a cohesive
Right, I think
cohesive thought or plan of how it's going to end. You interestingly state that it's written as though the characters have no idea what their destiny is and how they're going to end up.
Right, and I think that what especially, and this is, most first novels never get published. And to publish a masterpiece on your first try out, what's got to have it? It's not his training as a writer that's making his up. It's the passion and the expression that he uses, the passion gets in the way of a traditional structure with a beginning and a middle and an end to the novel, which is why, rightly so,
Say that again.
the passion
Yes.
gets in the way of in other words, your father was not going to let plot dictate what he was going to say.
Right.
Look, he's like the ancient mariner. Every time I met your father, he would run around and with me and other people, somewhere along the conversation, he'd get back to telling the story of the day his father died. And the wop is under the wrapper out in the alley. And it was like the rhyme of the ancient mariner where he has this albatross, and everywhere he goes, he's going to tell the story. And that being told, I think, in this way in this novel, is the most important thing. It's like he said, look, this is what I went through. You have it now.
Right.
I'm going to give this story to you, and you do with it what you will. There's nothing more I can do. And so it's like the novel is missing a third act. Like I always imagined, if I was going to make this into a film, if I had Ben's job, how would I do this? You can't take this novel and just do the novel right from the film the way you could, a novel like The Godfather, which is not as well written, I think. But it has a beginning, a middle, and an end.
Right.
What you'd have to do is you'd have to really cement it into Paul, the character, and he would have to come back as a contractor or as a union boss or something in the third act after Annunziata dies. Because then you would get the sense of, the father creating the son becoming the father, and so on and so forth.
The sequence of
Right,
their
and he
lives.
did go on and write some of that.
Now,
Yes,
speaking
yes.
of Paul, I wanted to ask Norma if you had any thoughts about the actor who played Paul, because I think that his accent is the only sign in this movie of it being a
British.
non-American
Well, a lot
production.
of, yes, and that's
yes,
always
and
been
that's
a laughing
very
point.
upsetting. It's
always
been-
always
always
been
been a
very
laughing point.
upsetting to
Right.
everybody.
Right.
Everyone who sees
Because
this
otherwise,
film-
and this is something
It needs sauce
this is
tonight.
something about this movie that has always
Upsets
startled
me.
me,
Right.
is that when you take a look at British films made in the 1940s and the early 1950s, the film industry there had not yet gotten up technically to the level that Hollywood was at. And movies made in England during that time, and things changed by the late 1950s. They were at least on par with Hollywood by then. But before then, there's really the sensation that there's a technical crudity that compares to Hollywood films of roughly 5 to 10 years previous. And this movie has none of that sensation. And there's an, I was struck because I had just,
That's because you had Hollywood pros.
and
Well,
that's basically it. It's a
Well,
Hollywood
except-
production
except
done in
for-
England.
Except for Pennington Richards, who's fantastic.
Right.
And by the way, here's Paul.
Here's
this,
Paul.
This character, this boy who just walked through the room right there, portrays my father. That would correspond to my father, Paul, in the novel. And of course, in this film, the boy has a minimal, minuscule part. And I want to comment real quickly before he leaves the room. That is Murden, who has an important role in the novel, and that is Murden, played by Sidney James. And he does a great job as Murden. Absolutely great. Look at those blacks. Look at that lighting. Oh, forget about it. It's fantastic.
It is.
That's
So
black.
beautiful.
That's black.
Yeah.
Oh, it's unbelievable.
Look at those bulbs. He just threw, photo floods in those sockets up there, and there it is, But if they weren't real pros and didn't know exactly what they were doing, it wouldn't have come out right.
Right.
It just wouldn't have looked right.
Yeah.
And here's the job that Murden has talked him into. His gut tells him it's not safe, but he's going to do it anyway.
This is one of the aspects that I find to be the most film noirish about it. I mean, obviously there's a very film noir look to it, and in the sense of the story being a tale of doom and futility, that's a very noir mood. But what I find here, as we get towards the latter part of the film, the last quarter, as it were, he at this point is beginning to step outside his own values. Here is where he's taking on a job that he believes to be unsafe and representing it to his friends, to the other five sticks that this is safe. So he's lying to them and putting his friends' lives at risk. And he's doing this for his wife and children, and therefore he can't turn to them for absolution or for escape, and this is driving him back into the arms of Kathleen Ryan. And these are his two affronts.
Well, it's well written.
And that is what brings the destruction down upon him, very disproportionately, but it reminds me of other film noirs like Ida Lupino's The Hitchhiker or Edgar G. Ulmer's Detour, where you have a character who does a very small infraction, a very minor crime, and the universe punishes the hell out of him for it.
Yeah, Ben captured that so beautifully. Just amazing.
I have seen the plans.
Yeah, I get lost just watching it
I know.
without the
Yes,
sound.
yes.
It's like
I do
forget we're
too.
here
just want to get pulled in
So
and
beautiful,
watch.
so wonderful.
And look at him. He says, even if it's going to fall on me and kill me, I know I'd have to
We
go.
still need, but that's the whole point. That's, you don't do it for yourself, you do it for your family, and you make these sacrifices.
And of course, in the novel, this is a very important scene. Ben did do this. He kind of pulled this directly from the novel. The premonitions the night before, in bed, speaking, and Jeremio just so tormented. And of course, Annunziata knowing that something really wrong and can't get it out of him. And he pulled it.
And Trevelyan couldn't get that scene out. He wanted that scene out because
They're both in
they
bed?
were in bed together. And I don't know how they got
Well,
it
there it
by,
is.
but there it is.
Knowing many weeks in advance that we'd be doing this commentary, and I'm thinking, gee, how can, in a few succinct sentences, can I try to portray what it was like to grow up with the author of the novel and so forth. And of course, Fred Riley throws in that that's a book in itself. But and I was wondering how I would do that. And then on a totally separate track, and speaking of separate tracks, I'm going to jump to this. Here we are. Here we are, because we've got it. Here's the fabulous set. This is all on the soundstage, on Benham Studios' largest soundstage, lit by C. Pennington Richards.
And once again, this is something that strikes me as very much in keeping with the noir tradition, in the sense that so much of what enervated noir was this dislocation of American society to an urban one, and this rapid modernization that had a kind of a dehumanizing effect. And you can see it in the titles of movies: Night in the City, Naked City, Frightened City, City That Never Sleeps, While the City Sleeps, L.A. Confidential, New York Confidential, Kansas City Confidential.
Right.
And here is a movie about the building of that noir landscape. They're making that city.
From Dimitrich's book, the one other set requiring great ingenuity was the four-story building which eventually collapses, killing Jeremiah. It was a half-demolished structure in the process of reconstruction, and the whole 4 stories had to be built on the stage. In Hollywood, the set would have been outside, but with British climate, they had to go inside. But all the scenes shot on this set were supposed to be played in broad daylight. Lighting a set that occupied the whole of the largest set in England was a sizable problem in any case. But I also wanted reality, and the sunlight reality's a single shadow. Lighting a large set inside a stage normally requires a multitude of light sources. I discussed the problem with Penny. He sucked air through his teeth and looked worried. While the set was in the process of construction, he spent all the spare time he could finding a solution. On the morning we started to shoot it, he was ready. He had taken the 4 largest sun arcs he could find in England and put them together in a tight 4-leaf cluster in the highest, most distant corner of the stage. The heat emanating from the 4 closely packed arcs was a serious problem. The scene would be set up and rehearsed in the dim light of the ceiling lamps, just like work lights, very dim lights. Then, with everyone set to jump off his marks, the camera would be turned and the arcs would be struck, turned on. The second I said cut on a finished scene, the switches would be pulled, leaving us basically stumbling around in the dark. And so you have this wonderful realism. Speaking of realism, as I said, I'm going to jump back to that thought. So I didn't know how exactly I would put it together, but a couple weeks ago I rented The Bicycle Thief. And then a week after that, I watched La Terra Trema, and it really just struck me the heart and soul of The Bicycle Thief, the father and the son, especially in the cafe scene where they've been searching all afternoon. And he says, "You know, we're men. We're going to relax. We're men. We can do whatever we want. Let's go in." He had just a few cents in his pocket, but he's going to go in and they're going to, let's get drunk. We're 2 men. The kid's about 7 years old. And they go in, and what I feel is one of the greatest scenes of all cinema. They sit and order some mozzarella, stringy mozzarella melted on toast, and a liter of white wine. And the kid sits and watches the rich family. And the rich eating course after course after course, and the father pulling the son into their problems, and pulling the son into the reality of their hardships. Having the kid figure on paper, if I can find the bicycle, I'll be able to make so much money, and to eat like those people over there, you have to make so much money a month, and this and that. And then he realizes that he needs the help of the fortune teller to find the bicycle, and he goes to the fortune. Now the fortune teller is a strong theme in Christ in Concrete also. Right. And then seeing La Terra Trema, which is that story essentially of the fisherman struggling to buy a house and so forth, or he mortgages his house to buy a boat and so forth. It's Christ in Concrete translated to the fishing village, and I realize the controversy and rebuttal will swirl around what I'm about to say, but after rescreening De Sica's Bicycle Thief and Visconti's La Terra Tremenda, in my mind there is absolutely no doubt that Christ in Concrete,
We must have more shoring.
39 novel, which was read in 1945 by virtually all the Italian filmmaking community. That's a young Zeffirelli, a young Carlo Rossi, a young Fellini, Rossellini, Visconti, De Sica, was the single most seminal artistic influence on the style which would become known as Italian neorealism or neorealism. And ironically, Fred, Dad would be the last to recognize that and realize
Sure,
that. He
sure.
just wasn't paying attention. Those guys were unquestionably inspired by the realism, not just the documentary look, because of like Open City, but the core of the realism which inspired them. I mean, in the early 70s, Antonioni told Pietro in Rome, Christ in Concrete, the novel, is the reason I became an artist, the reason I went into filmmaking. If it weren't for Christ in Concrete, I would not have wanted to become an artist. It was at the core. Christ in Concrete, the story, the book, is the core artistic incentive for pushing the style to create, and which would become Italian neorealism. I am absolutely positive of this. And tell us, some people think that it's a lyrical book and that it's poetic and so forth. But what is it realism? Is it a new?
It is definitely, but it's not just realism in the sense of Steinbeck is realism, and it's not romanticism, and it's not modernism. In a sense, I mean, I hadn't thought about it until you said it, but it is kind of a new form of realism. But there's also expressionism in there, and there's, it's a synthesis of all this. And I think, but the bottom line is, I mean, if you look at it, it's real in the sounds of the work and so on and so forth. And what Di Donato does in this novel is he creates a poetry around work. He's not a poet who creates work, he's a worker who creates poetry. And that, I think, is the key. When you see La Terra Trema, you have these artists who are using real people as actors, and they're achieving an effect. But here is a real worker who's creating the scene.
Yes.
And that, to me,
Yes.
is,
I mean, look at the.
you're just going to send all the neo-realist historians to shelter now, because they're going to have to rewrite their whole books.
Well, I'm glad I could get things cracking. Maybe it's about time.
If they hear this.
But what happened to me was I was watching, and I wasn't looking for it. I was watching that scene in The Bicycle Thief. The child, his father, enjoying that wine and trying to forget their problems for a few short minutes. And all of a sudden, I was, bawling like a baby, and the tears were just flowing down. And I wondered why. Why am I reacting like this? It was bizarre. And I realized that there I was, and there was my father, and it was identical. It was identical. And there is neorealism.
Yeah, because I think what happened, why did you need...
Yeah, I think it has to be explored.
Right, why did you need a neo-realism? What was wrong with the realism? And I think that what was wrong with the realism was that there were people trying to be real, as opposed to real people just telling it like it is. And I think that's...
Yes.
Look at those bare bulbs.
Essentially what's happened here is Jeremio has become the American. And you can see the alienation. He goes around from place to place, almost like a pinball.
Good point.
And
And we see him dressed very differently than the others.
Oh, sure, he's a
always
Medigan.
dressed in this very
Yes.
Definitely
immaculate
Medigan.
suit.
There's the steaming manhole covers.
And this is that kind of
Yeah.
noir
Yeah.
expressionism.
Yeah.
Just
Yeah, David, we've talked about this so much. You can't pigeonhole this film. It's an American story, written by an Italian, made by Americans, shot in England, shot in '47, about a period in the early 20s. A cast from America, Italy, England. I mean, it is it's such an amazing hybrid. This film, you just can't put your finger on it. There's nothing else like it out there.
But-
Norma, there isn't.
Made by blacklisted
Yes.
Americans.
Yes.
You have to make that point because
I'm glad you said that.
they are, Eddie and Ben, after all, they'd struggled within the Writers Guild and the Directors Guild. You have to remember the struggle in Hollywood, why we were blacklisted, why the Hollywood 10 went to jail. They were active in their unions and guilds and unions, and it has a lot to do with this expresses that feeling which Fred has talked about so aptly, the feeling of working people together. And they both did feel that, and they both, by the way, came out of,
Hard times.
well, not only that, but very similar Canadian terrible childhoods where they really struggled, and so they both felt it and they knew it. They came out of that and they understood it.
I mean, it's amazing this film ever got made. Geiger was a wonderful, beautiful guy, producer, but he was a real shyster, a real operator of the first very high class. Here's a quick passage from Dimitrich's book, 1978 autobiography. All of us believed in the film so much that it was almost a crusade, Norma, almost a crusade.
Exactly. Well, you have to realize that when we got to England to find out that there was no money to pay Ben, and for a long time the question was, would Ben sign a form from the Bank of England and say that he had been paid, otherwise that film would never be made,
couldn't start
even
shooting.
though they couldn't start shooting it unless he said, I have been paid, when he hadn't been paid, and knew that very probably if he signed that, he would never be paid. So, yes, it was a crusade.
Yes.
And we didn't talk about I started to tell about that beginning with Eddie pushing that book at him, and then me pushing the book at Ben because Ben really did not want to do it. And Eddie Dimitrich said, Ben, you're going to do it nights and weekends. And Ben turned to me and said, am I going to do it nights and weekends? And I said, yes, this project is worth it in every way, not just to break the blacklist, but what it says. This is so important. This is everything we want to say. It is our whole political, spiritual, everything. This is it.
The vehicle for the crusade. Fred, you know, we just saw Jeremio, Dapper Dan, cleaning his fingernails, getting ready to go out and see his girlfriend. You've heard Dad speak about Jeremio so often.
It's amazing that there's not more of this in the novel, because from what your father talked about Jeremio, you would expect it to be there, and sometimes the philanderer. But what happens is the philandering is a result of the inability to achieve his sense of identity through the community. And that's what America does.
It's that
America,
frustration.
It is. He wouldn't have
we were talking
driven
about
to
it.
that,
It's the
to that woman.
frustration in the work.
Yeah.
There it goes. There it goes.
That's
The
it.
years.
The dream is gone.
Years and the dream is gone.
And all that
it's
work.
all gone.
But it's a job. Job has done this.
Yes.
You know, job gives life. Job takes life away, and it's totally this alienation. It's not. It's breaking away from the community that does this. And I think that the men who put this film together recreated the community in the making of this film. Now, it was in microcosm. But you know, to me, it's an incredible injustice that this film has to be like a found penny on the ground. If you're walking by, you won't see it. I mean, my lucky day was when I found this, and literally on the ground. I have a copy that is almost totally washed out. I've been showing it for about the last 10, 12 years in my classes to students who don't like black and white films to begin with. And but when I work them through this, they begin to see things that you don't see in any other noir films, let alone films from the period.
Now, speaking of noir, we're coming up.
This is so beautiful.
We're coming up on an important point that I really want to talk about, which is the flashback.
Yes.
That is, of course, a classic noir technique to to have an enormous bulk of a film told in
Well,
flashback.
the end of the
way
flashback coming up to real time, and then starting
Right,
from
right.
there.
A similar sort of setup to Out of the Past, where you have these are noir stories. The same with spaghetti westerns. These are stories about how the past is always with us. That the events, traumatic events that may have happened decades ago, are still very much in the present day. And so it is very interesting to me that that is a technique applied to this film. But specifically, the way it works here, I think, is a very neat trick that Ben did, because we know, having read the book, that the end of the story is that Jeremio is going to be killed in this accident. The audience for the movie does not necessarily know that. And if you go into the movie and the story were told chronologically, and you lead up to this horrible event at the end, they're going to walk out of the theater angry that the main character has been killed. But the cool thing about this is that we see out of context at the beginning of the film that his family life is falling apart, that he's having an affair, that his life is in shambles, and we see him at his most desperate moment. We don't really understand what that scene means, but he begins to go into the story, telling his girlfriend, here's how I met my wife. And so now we watch the whole rest of the story unfold with him romancing and marrying, and here's his life with Annunziata. And we always know through that whole story, well, eventually this falls apart. As wonderful and romantic as that all seems, we know from the beginning of the movie this is going to go wrong. When we ultimately catch up with it, it's not nearly as bad as seeing it out of context led us to believe. When we return to this scene now, and we understand it in context, it seemed when we saw it at the beginning of the film.
Which brings us to some of the early reviews stating that the beginning was a bit over melodramatic.
Right,
and so
but it works because it has prepped the audience. We have now watched almost the whole film anticipating destruction.
Right.
We still have that emotional sensation going as we now lead into what is the real destruction.
Right.
So we've been prepped for the wrong thing, but it's got us in the right mood. And it's, I think, the same way that American Beauty is set up. We see a scene at the beginning that lets us know the character's going to die,
Right.
but we have the wrong impression of what that means,
Right.
but we're in the right mood for it when it
Right.
happens. So there's still, we're ready for something bad to happen, but it can still be a surprise when it happens.
Who could put that better than David Khaled of All Day Entertainment? I ask you now. And Norma, let me say, this scene, I rewatched this scene a couple of times in the last couple of weeks, and I really listened. Folks, rewind this scene, the beginning of the scene, where it starts with the flashback essentially ends, and we begin with real time from this moment on, with him standing there with the bandage back about a minute and a half from this moment right here. Just rewind it and listen to all this dialogue. This dialogue is at the core of his disillusionment of his life. What do we really want? What went wrong? Was it enough? I mean, this scene is the dialogue is so rich that it's hard to digest the first time.
But that's the core of redemption, is communication and a chance to I mean, without this communication going on, the audience and the couple themselves. So when you leave this scene, you're thinking, it's going to be all right. You are, because they're beginning to understand there's communication going on here.
Yeah, and the guys make friends again, and everything's going to be all right.
And so to me, psychologically, this is a kind of a masterful touch, a way of kind of leading us, keeping us away from the ending that we know from the novel. Maybe he will come to his senses and bring his buddies together and strike down Mr. Murden, who's so aptly named Murdering.
Never thought of that. And this, of course, David, this is the scene that is referred to a lot as far as the lighting goes. C. Pennington Richards created he lit the main characters and then lit the entire rest of the set with just a couple of bulbs in the lamps. Yeah. And I love that scene. I love that scene.
Ben was so happy about the way he used the flashback in this. We had a long dispute between us about flashbacks. We did the Locket together, and which is now being a classic, and maybe you'll get to that. But anyway, but Ben in the beginning just hated the way I wanted to use the flashback. He said it had to advance the story, and it had to this and it had to that. But in the Locket, I felt it was a revelation of how sick she was and how tortured her mind. You know the film? I don't know if you,
No,
oh,
and,
you
and
don't.
as you say in the book, it becomes flashbacks within flashbacks.
Yeah.
Yes.
See, this is almost like the Pietà, almost, a mother forgiving her son, the
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
come back, my man, and we'll see what we can do here. And
Fred, you're the master of the.
I'm telling you, this is
Yes,
you
yes.
need to-
Fred, that's good.
it's
that's right.
yeah. I mean, what Di Donato does is he brings a sense of Italian culture to the United States that it's never seen before. It's only come from on high, through Henry James. In fact, when
Right.
Henry James started looking at the real Italians he said, these people are scum. Give me the people I met in Rome. These immigrants
Right.
here in Boston Commons are not.
Right.
And Di Donato, this is the first major way, because prior to this, I mean, the films that I show prior to this, you get Little Caesar. Before that, you get the Italian, the Ince film, which is a real horrendous portrayal of Italians.
Ince? I'm sorry?
Ince,
It's film.
INCE.
Ince.
Oh, okay.
And called the Italian, and this is really the first major. I mean, you're going to get a little bit from Capra in It's a Wonderful Life and things like that, but this is it, and it's there. It's classic, and that's the key, I think, what Di Donato brings.
Do you think any of that anti-Italian prejudice was one of the reasons that the book did not continue to be a popular and successful novel
Well,
after 1939?
Sure.
Okay.
Well, I think
I've got to stop you
okay.
guys here. This is one of the most fabulous pieces of cinematography you're ever going to see. Watch. We go from no background, flat, to tremendous depth of field, everything in focus.
Yeah.
Look at this, and Jeremio facing the whole gang for the first time. Look at that lighting. I'm sorry to cut you off.
No, but
that's
I'll
classic.
come back to that. But I think that what happens is when this film is made, it's a difficult time. It's after World War II. Italy and the United States are becoming a little bit more friendly, but the image of Italy still is not very strong in the United States. And then we shift from there into the blacklisting period. I mean, the blacklisting period is going on, so we get to communism, and Italy is very strongly, post-World War II, very strongly communist. And then we get into the organized crime, so it takes a while. And this is why the book is dormant. The book is dormant until the kind of ethnic revival of the 60s. And then later on, in the late 60s, when you kind of have this renewal of a sense of working class literature. And that's why now we're just beginning to talk about working class studies in the academy. And so Christ in Concrete will reach its proper place at the pinnacle of academic study, I would say in the next 5 or 10 years, as a working class. I did an article called Christ in Conceit. The metaphor of Christ as a laborer, as a worker, as a radical, as and so on. And you see this up throughout Di Donato's writing to the day he died. He wrote this fantastic book, of which I think I'm the only one who ever published an excerpt of it, called The Gospels, the American Gospels.
Don't worry, Fred. We'll get it published.
All right.
On Christ, at the end of Christ Recrucified, I don't think you have seen it, the Jules
No,
Dassin
no.
film that Ben wrote the screenplay of. Ben has
You're the worst
The-
informant I've ever worked with.
young man, it's Peter Van Eyck, your Peter Van Eyck,
Saying in my province, there's
who
no
plays
child worse
the
than
Christ
the
in the Passion Play every
Generosity
year.
is well known.
And
I'm
now
as big as the
he's
dome of St.
defending
Peter's.
his community against the Turks. And Christ passes the ammunition. That's Ben's last shot of the film. It's a film that you must get and you must see, because it's an extraordinary film.
Well, to think, Christ must have been a hell of a radical to be able to pull such a thing off in a country of Jews, So,
Yes.
so it's there, and that I think is the key. If Di Donato was solid about one thing, it was about this right here: the community of men working together, the pride, the love, the joy, the support. And when you separate yourself is when you get depressed and you get led into the wrong directions. And when you're together, you're strong.
But
Now-
Ben really captured it.
Oh,
Look at
yeah,
it. I mean, he really got it. It's,
Yeah,
he
he got.
understood it, he knew it in himself, and he got it.
Yeah, he got it in a way that I don't even think Di Donato could have gotten it. Because I've read his
I know.
screenplays, what he tried.
Fred, you knew Dad well. the reality of it is that the young 28-year-old that wrote the book in '39, who believed in the proletariat, who believed in the community, who believed in the working man, looking out for each other, banding together, and creating the new society, you know, the utopian working man society, the melting pot, in his opinion, in Didenau's opinion, by the 60s and 70s, had turned into a cesspool, and he lost faith in the common man. He lost faith in his own Italian people, and he became very, very bitter, and realized that the idealistic young writer who wrote it at 28 years old was kidding himself that the common man could ever care about his fellow common man to the point where they would all band together and create a new society. He was totally disillusioned.
What were you trying to point out, Norma?
I want people to realize how Sam walked, how he stood, how he became Jeremio. As no actor, that was an Oscar-winning performance. That was one of the great performances of all time, for God's sake.
And his only performance.
And Sam really dug it, and he felt it,
Right.
and he was sick during this. He would, you know, when it would, the parts that he really was feeling very terribly, he would get stomach pains. But there's from the beginning, if you notice the difference in his walk as a very young guy, did you notice how very
stilted,
different?
yeah.
Yes.
And now it's
And
very
everything
confident.
that happened to him, he changed the way he moved,
Yeah.
the way he everything. It was a stunning performance.
And the effect of the blacklist on him, I think, was that he got so many fewer film roles as a result. He ended up being
Yes.
much more of a theater actor
Yes.
than,
And of
than
course-
a movie actor. This is a very it's
And
a
of course,
rare film.
restoring the old Vic in England.
Yes.
He stayed. He went to England to make this film, and he never came back.
Yeah.
Okay, I just want to say one word on that because it is important about Sam. That when we arrived in England in February '49 and met Sam, and he took us over that area, it's in the book, the Red and the Blacklist. He took us over the Shakespeare part of London, the Globe, and he said, I want to get this restored. That was already, he said, I'm glad Christ brought me to England so I can do this.
And his
And
daughter,
it ultimately was done, although he wasn't there to see
Yes,
it.
it
was his
they-
accomplishment.
and his wonderful daughter, who became a big English
Yes,
star.
Zoe.
Zoe Wanamaker.
Zoe,
But
the
Sam
kid-
had an interesting role in The Spy That Came In From the Pole with Richard Burton, and of course he had played a lawyer in the Blacklist movie, Guilty by Suspicion, which is Norma has lectured me on, and I agree with her.
It's really
Terrible,
awful. It's
muddled.
Terrible cop-out, muddled cop-out,
Right.
a very bad Blacklist.
Okay.
But see, here, I want to show you this scene here. I mean, you get a sense of up on a ship or a scaffolding, but not only that, but a hanging, you know, in
Yeah.
a sense.
Yes,
Yes.
interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting. And by the way, great,
It's
a
huge
great,
set.
incredible montage coming up. This is again one of the only. Look at that piece of equipment. You don't see equipment and the real equipment of building and pouring concrete and so forth. It's never been portrayed before. This is an absolute. I don't think even a modern day filmmaker could do it quite like this. It's just got that
It is
terrible
brilliant. It was
authenticity. It's just
absolutely, Eddie did a marvelous job.
My God, what a technician!
No question.
What a technician! And
But even more than that, I mean, he felt this
Oh,
picture.
absolutely.
And Ben was there every day, including this, and Eddie, I have to say this for Eddie also, he listened to Ben. He was not like some directors.
yeah.
He did listen to him, and Ben there was a lot of input from
real
Ben.
teamwork,
Yeah.
a real collaboration, like Open City. You have a bunch of great artists collaborating. 9 times out of 10, you're going to end up with a better product than some highfalutin director who has to call every little shot and not trust what someone else says. Okay, here comes. Watch the editing of this montage.
Yeah, this is worth being
Boom.
quiet.
Boom.
Yes.
Boom. Boom.
Yeah. It's,
Rod Geiger said that they had this part of the set built on a large dolly, and they shook the whole thing so it would collapse, and they could only do it once. That's what Geiger told me.
I assume that was a stuntman who did the fall.
Looked like him, but he probably just
I
went
think
on
he
to
did
something
part
safe.
of it. He did part of that fall.
Fred.
I think he did
Fred,
the
how
fall.
much symbolism do we have here?
This is it. This is what the image of imagining how it would have been for your father to die.
My father laid more brick than his father did. My father laid
Sure.
many more brick than my grandfather did, who died. And my father was always fearful of dying on the job.
But the hardest thing is knowing that this is written down somewhere, and how do you do it, and what goes on, and what comes out of his mouth, and the attempt to eat his way. I mean, one of the strongest images in the novel is attempting to eat his way. He's so, the force of life is so strong that he breaks teeth.
Now, speaking of what he
And-
says,
yeah,
this
yes.
is, yes.
Ben had written that Jeremiah calls on the saints
And Jesus.
and Jesus and the saints. And Trevelyan, the censor, said you can't have unanswered prayers. You can't have. He cannot call on them. Absolutely not. So Ben said, okay, we'll have Sam call on his wife and his children's
children. So,
names.
in his mind-
and then it worked better. Ben was happier with what happened.
And
what he had to do.
and that truly does work. And by the way,
And it does work.
The
Do we know what that
the
is that
soundtrack
he's-
is a little bit muddled, and the way they used a lot of heavy reverb back then, and I felt that I could never understand what names he was saying. And so I find out from Norma, he's calling his children.
his wife and his children.
So
What-
for our
I was going to ask, do we know
viewers,
what that substance was that was the
I'm hoping it
so-called
was
co-
oatmeal.
that was popcorn.
I don't know,
David,
but I always,
that's popcorn.
It was popcorn?
Yeah.
Okay.
I always die when he dies.
This is a beautiful, beautiful scene. By the way, Fred, Jeremiah's death, my grandfather's death, was one of the beginning, if not the beginning, pivotal
That's
case.
Phil Brown.
Oh, really?
Oh, really? Wow. My grandfather's death was one of the pivotal cases that started workman's compensation in New York State. Okay? So this is very, very important and very historic.
Phil was an actor's lab. He was also blacklisted, you understand. Phil Brown was blacklisted in America. That's why Eddie took him with him to be his assistant in London. Couldn't work anymore in America. Also.
And of course, in her mind, she had been accusing these men of being soft. And
How much is a man's life worth?
well, at least now he's bought the house.
Yeah.
How poignant, how poignant.
Yeah, it's,
Yes, and I have to
Way above
apologize
money.
for the scratches on the image. We
This is a
did
beautiful,
what we
this is
could.
a beautiful restoration,
Oh,
David.
this
You don't
is-
apologize
Oh, it's
for anything.
beautiful.
compared to
Don't
what I've been using
apologize
for the last 12 years.
It's a whole, it's so beautiful. I'm just torn to bits. It's so beautiful.
And you haven't seen it like this in 55 years.
No.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, with this fade, and as they start down the hallway, and I can't help but feel that my grandmother did feel some of these thoughts
Sure.
when she found out that she got $1,000 for Jeremiah's life. And what a beautiful job Leia does.
Oh, God, yes.
I'm so glad you could see this again at this time, Norma, in this condition. I'm so
I
proud
am
that you could be
too.
here with
I'm
us
so
today.
happy.
yeah, I'm
I'm very
very
happy
honored.
to be here
I'm honored
today.
to be here.
I am very glad to
And
be
if it
here.
weren't for David Cowlett's incredible, determined work to bring this to the world,
This would have been a phone
Well,
call.
I'm tremendously honored to have had a chance to work on a film
what a
of this
beautiful,
incredible
beautiful
power
restored
and
print from the
quality.
British Film Institute,
British Film Institute.
Yes.
from the original.
This was
masters.
the original duplication nitrate from 1949.
A master.
Yes, this was the master from which the release prints were made.
Wow. Thanks so
Oh.
much, David.
Yes, David.
Yeah, this
Thank
is
you
gonna- I mean,
so much.
Because this is going to be
This
such
is-
a strong part of history forever.
Well, this is congratulations time. It's very
is.
beautiful and very wonderful.
Norma flew from Beverly Hills to be here with us today on the East Coast to do this. Just for this.
Yeah, that's true.
55 years after it was made.
There were the monthly payments for the children. Whatever else.
That interaction between the church and we can go on and talk about this, but
You can see why Sophia wanted to play Annunziata.
Your friend Sophie Loren. And
I
so
mean,
ladies and
later she
gentlemen,
always, and why she called Ben in when she couldn't stand the script of El Cid.
And so ends the 1949 film adaptation of Pietro di Donato's Christ in Concrete, directed by Edward Dmytryk and written by Ben Barsman. My sincere thanks to David Callett, Fred Gardefeu, and Norma Barsman for screening the film with all of us and their tremendous insight into this rediscovered classic. Thanks so much, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.